G'day, mate. Welcome along to episode 84 of the Exponential Performance Podcast. It is good to have you here today. Today, we're going to be talking about two main topics. The first one is about resistance bands versus traditional kind of weight-based strength training. And we're also going to be talking about winter training, since here in New Zealand, we are deep into the first month of winter, and I have already had people struggling a little bit, and we're not even past the shortest day yet. So, Nick Taylor, how are you, mate?
I am good, thank you. I am potentially suffering from some of those winter blues myself. We've had about a week of drizzle, cloud, rain, everything is wet, and we went from everything being really dry, so it's really dry, fast-running trails to ride my bike on. Now I have nothing. So I have to switch over to the old gravel cyclocross bike, get out the winter jacket and harden up.
Mate, do I have a segment for you today? You just wait till winter training. You're going to be running out of the office to get out there training this afternoon. It's going to be fantastic. Hey, why don't you kick us off on our first little segment today about bands, resistance bands, big stretchy elastic bands, and traditional weight training, and some of the interesting stuff you've been doing around that lately.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to kind of give some background to it all, about 6 months ago, so the start of this year, I started back into a formalised sort of strength training plan at a gym here in Dunedin called Body Synergy. Now they do things a little bit differently than standard, but for me the main focus was to reduce some pain. So I've been getting some serious back and neck pain, mainly due to the amount of hours I spend driving my car for work, but also I spend a lot of time on my bike as well, which is not a natural position. It's not always the most comfortable, and the two of them combined have kind of made me a lot weaker than I had been in the past. So my muscle sort of bulk and muscle strength had dropped away through endurance training and hours sitting down, and that was contributing to the pain. So I went back to see the team at Body Synergy, Rowan and Ricky, and they were able to sort of put together a sort of functional rehab program to start with for me, and since then I've been progressing back to doing some more traditional kind of weight strength lifting exercises and some sort of core and some circuit training too that they do down there. So when I say they do things a little bit differently, Rowan Ellis is the founder of a program called Dr. or Mr. EMG, I should say, Mr. EMG, and that is an EMG machine, which is electromyography, which is always a tricky word to get out of the mouth, and that is all around placing electrodes on the body to measure muscle activation. So when we contract a muscle, it sends an electrical current to the muscle, depending on how strong we have asked the muscle to work, and that records a signal which we can pick up through this EMG machine. So therefore you can throw one on your bicep, you can do a bicep curl, and hey presto, ideally the bicep muscle is firing an electrical signal through that action. Now the reason they utilise this machine down there, and they've been working on that for probably 15 years or so now, is with pain and muscle sort of or strength training, it can be quite easy to train the wrong muscles. So for example, if you're doing a bicep curl and your shoulders are up around your neck, trying to lift more weight, then you're really going to be putting a lot of stress through your traps and less of that through your bicep when you actually want to be working your bicep. And traps tend to be one of the biggest ones that people are overactivating, whether it be sitting here right now, sort of hunching up at the desk, in the car. For me, if it was I'd spend a lot of time with my arm on the side of the door, and that sort of pulls everything in the spine and creates some of that pain. So basically, they bring you into the gym, they set you up on some of their machines, and you just do some basic resistance training exercises with electrodes on your traps, basically trying not to record anything. And it's quite interesting when you're staring at a screen, watching these wee lines go up and down, that you can actually shut them off. You know, sitting on a stationary bike for me was a big thing. You know, sort of traps would start to pull up. Okay, right, how do I work out to get them dropped back down, dropping those shoulders, squeezing those elbows in. And it's been life-changing essentially for me this year. The pain that I had experienced for the last couple of years is pretty much gone.
Wow.
I still get a wee bit of stiffness and soreness from riding my bike or working out in the gym, but it's that kind of good, like, oh, yeah, it worked quite hard today, instead of that, you get out of the car or get out of bed and you need to be putting some heat on or taking some painkillers to help get on top of it. So it's been fantastic for me.
Yeah, mate, you're getting old, but shit, you're too young for that.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And my solution prior to go back to the gym was I need a new car for work. I need to stop doing my job and find something else. But that wasn't necessarily a viable option straight away. So it was all about how can I get on top of this. And one of the things that I had forgotten through many years ago, I did some work with these guys, but the concept that a strong muscle is a pain-free muscle, essentially. And a tight muscle is generally a weaker muscle. So we think, oh, I've got tight hamstrings or tight glutes. So we go and stretch the crap out of them. And that tends to make them a little bit longer, relieves a little bit of that tension initially, but it doesn't actually start making them stronger and allow them to do their job and stabilising the body, which is why they're getting sort of tight in the first place. So by doing some structured resistance training, doing exercises that I know are actually working the correct muscles, I think has been fantastic at reducing that pain, getting me strong, and then enabling me to do my biking outside of that. It's been cool.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear, mate. I know you've struggled with a few aches and pains in the past, so that's awesome to hear that you're starting to get on top of them. Tell us about that stuff you were telling me before around the bands and the EMG stuff you were doing with that last week, because that sounded super interesting.
Yeah, perfect. So an exercise that some people may have done, you may have seen it on YouTube or Instagram, is you're lying or sitting on the ground with your shoulders on a bench. You've got a weight bar or a dumbbell across your hips, and essentially you're squeezing your glutes and driving yourself up to form a nice flat bridge. You might have done it on a Swiss ball or without the bench, but using the bench we tend to call it a hip thruster or a glute bridge or a weighted glute bridge. There's probably about 50 different names for exercises that there tends to be around the world. Yep. But it's a fantastic exercise for glute activation, which is such a fundamental muscle that we use obviously for walking, cycling, and general day-to-day, let alone sporting activities. But at the gym, it's one of those exercises where, as I've been getting stronger, I've been able to do more and more weight. So sort of getting up around the 130, 140 kg mark with a barbell across your hips is getting quite uncomfortable and quite tricky to actually lift it up and get the activation you want. So not specifically because of me, but the gym brought a new piece of equipment recently, which was enabling essentially to get inside of this bar or with bands on a bit easier to do more of these glute bridges, because they're such a fantastic exercise across a whole spectrum of people, and not everyone wants to be lifting heavy weight on their waist. But essentially we set it up last week, and trying to get into it was horrendously hard. So the way it was all structured, once the barbell's across the top, I was kind of on my side, sort of shoving my legs under, trying to lift the bar up a little bit to get underneath it. It was just very unpractical once the bar got quite heavy. And it got me talking with Ron and Ricky about the difference, maybe using the bands and the bar. Could we simulate the sort of the same 130, 140 kgs with some resistance or power bands? Now I probably should have prefaced all this with a resistance power band sort of conversation as to what they are, but they are a giant rubber band essentially. Probably everyone listening to this podcast has been given a TheraBand at some point by a physiotherapist, which is like a thin kind of piece of stretchy elastic. Basically, it generally looks open at one end, open at two ends, so it's not a rubber band. A power band or resistance band in this case is a rubber band, so it's a complete circle, and it's a lot thicker generally. And you stretch them out and the resistance increases, and then you have to fight the resistance back in.
And you can get a bunch of different thicknesses for different amount of resistance. Yeah.
And I would love it to be as easy as to tell you what those different resistances are, but as soon as you change brands, generally they change resistance. So relatively standardised, but not good enough to go on record and say what one should weigh. But basically, we got the conversation boiled down to using the EMG. We could hook some up to my glutes, so my right and left glute max, and my glute med out on the sides, and look at the activation between me trying to lift 130 kgs with the barbell and me using two of the resistance bands that they had there, kind of a medium to heavy resistance, and see the activation and what were the differences. So we jumped in and did a little sort of mini on-the-spot testing session. So we used the barbell, like I said, the power bands, and we also used a heavy dumbbell just to see what the difference was, whether the limiting feature was the fact that this barbell gets so heavy across your hips, that's the limiting feature to activation. And like I said, EMGs on the 2 glute max, 2 glute mids, and then measured that over 4 attempts with me trying to go maximally. That was based on the assumption that my sort of 4 rep max was about 130 kgs. So I'd be lifting maximally with the barbell and then trying to replicate that with the bands itself. Now, it's probably not too surprising given the way that this conversation has been going that the bands actually provided a greater muscle recruitment on all 4 of those EMG sites compared to the dumbbell and compared to the barbell. So essentially I was lifting two resistance bands, no heavy weight across my waist, really easy to get in and out of, and I was able to generate more muscle activation than I was when I was lifting 130 kgs, which would be my kind of max output.
Is that more peak muscle activation or more total across time throughout the movement? What are we talking there?
In this instance, it was peak. So that was, so the time was about the same. We tried to keep that as standard as we could. We did do some more testing with another one of the gym members after that and looked at a sort of a more slower ramp up to a peak. So obviously you're able to accommodate more time at the peak as well. But it's certainly both of those, or sort of certainly the time at the peak with the barbell would be hard to sustain. The limiting feature, I think, and we found that with the barbell, you get to a certain point where you just can't fully extend the hip because you've got a bar sitting in the crease of your hips. And then if you were to go to flat, the barbell can roll either way. So it all starts.
So when you say peak, you're meaning the peak was higher at the top part of the movement?
Generally speaking, would be at the top of the movement, given this movement pattern. Because you can't, most people can't extend their hips past a certain point unless you might be a gymnast.
Yep, absolutely.
And interestingly, when we looked at the dumbbell, so the dumbbell only weighed 50 kgs, and the dumbbell activation and the barbell activation at 130 kgs was about the same. And so again, that last piece of that hip extension was the key component to getting the greater muscle activation. Which is quite cool to see, again, too. So I don't have to try and squeeze myself into this machine to load up the bar. I can jump in with the bands and perform a workout probably better than I was with the barbell and potentially get a greater activation. And the other interesting thing for me around the sort of the safety side of that is with the barbell, again, at 130 kgs, there's always an element of, my back's sort of on its limit of what it can hold. If you do fail, you're going to come crashing back down to the ground with this weight on top of you. And with the bands, it's safe. You're stretching up. If you need to stop, you just stop and the bands will sort of sit on your chest. They're not weighing so much in an awkward position and placing extra stress on the body.
That's super interesting.
And so it got me thinking around what is out there in the research in this sort of area. There's not a heap of research with muscle activation, EMG, and different sort of strength modalities and different resistance exercises. But I did stumble across a meta-analysis that was looking at essentially this. So the elastic resistance or bands versus traditional resistance, in this case sort of weightlifting, and the EMG muscle activation of those different exercises. So their findings essentially concluded what we did, that even though there's not a lot of research in this field, the resistance bands across a raft of different exercises was providing a greater or the same muscle activation as the traditional weightlifting modality for that exercise, which is quite cool. Thought about to validate your own personal findings with some research out there.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. It's cool. It's as applied as it gets.
Yeah, totally. And that's hopefully we can get Rowan on the podcast in the next few weeks to talk about his machines, because he's just about to launch them around the place to different practitioners because of that reason. It's super hands-on. You can work out what's going on right then and then, and it has a huge application for pain management especially, but also for all different types of hands-on therapists, really.
Yeah, nice. And I'm just thinking, and potentially glossed over the fact there a little bit, that when we're thinking that a muscle is more activated than a less activated muscle, there's more of a stimulus to drive strength adaptations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah,
and so if you can achieve the same or more activation, but with less weight, you're going to get more strength adaptations, even though you're not lifting the same weight, because the muscles is activated, and a lot of the adaptations that come for strength are neuromuscular, meaning that the nerves are firing more muscle fibers to contract more to produce more strength. So it's not about was the band the same weight as the weight on your hips, because if the activation is the same, then the adaptation or the drive, the stimulus to get the strength adaptation is the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And it leads to a good question around, so with the dumbbell essentially being a third of the weight, providing the same level of activation as the barbell, what's happening in that rest of that lift that I'm doing at 130 kgs? And there is absolutely other muscles that come into play at a certain point. So you're maximally recruiting your glutes, but you're still lifting a weight. So hamstrings are going, calves are going, quads are going. You're straining against the back of the bench. So there's a whole raft of other muscle groups that are kicking in and doing something. And that sort of, I guess, simply comes down to what's the end goal for your lift. If you're in there really wanting to isolate your glutes and fire them up for sprinting, let's say, then the bands is possibly going to be a greater option. If you're looking for a good whole body conditioning exercise, then maybe the barbell's a good option. And it's sort of this enabling people to potentially switch around and use different options for loading up their resistance work. I know for me with traveling quite a bit, if I can jump in the motel unit with a strength band and do a workout that I know is going to be giving me some decent activation, then that's awesome while I'm away, and then come back and use some weights in the gym, or combination of weight plus a band or whatever it might be. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's the thing, is that you're not saying one's better than the other. It's that you can get the similar stimulus from either or. And whether you're traveling or whether you're locked down at home, like multiple people around the world at the moment, where we got these rolling lockdowns in different countries, and if you can get some resistance bands that are, I'm not even going to chuck a number, I'm going to say like quarter of the price of what some weight gear would be, you got yourself a pretty good setup to be able to get strength adaptations at home, and in a super safe, effective manner as well.
Yep. And there's a whole raft of different options for strength bands. The TRX systems are similar in a way. Anything that's able to apply an elastic force. And I think that's the key, is when you look at the strength profile of doing, let's say, again, a bicep curl with a traditional weight, the force application starts off at the bottom and gets more and more and more to a certain point, and then it tails away as you get closer to the shoulder, versus the band starts off a lot lower and the peak kind of arises at the top, and you've still got that kind of eccentric force pulling you back down for a while. So the strength profile still looks similar, just applied in a sort of slightly different position of the lift as well.
Yeah, for sure. And if people aren't too familiar, what Nick's talking about there is that when you lift a free weight or a dumbbell, and the bicep curl is a good example there, is that we're always lifting against gravity, and gravity is only goes in one direction, and that's down. So depending on the angle of your arm or the joint lever at the time, the force or the load on the muscle will differ throughout the movement because of its position in space in relation to gravity as well. So I think it's like the bottom 15 or 20 degrees of a bicep curl, there's essentially no load because you're not lifting the weight up at that stage. You're moving it away from your body for the first portion of a bicep curl. And it's not until it actually starts traveling upwards that the load comes onto your muscle. So that initial part, what a lot of people will do, and if you've ever done bicep curls, you probably, or seen someone do it, you'll probably see them do it, is they'll get a little bit of momentum in that first little bit, maybe put their hips into it as well to swing it through that bottom phase where there's not much load, and then that'll help carry them through the phase where it's the most load coming on the muscle when your arm's sort of out from your body. And then as it gets to the top, you've overcome all of that gravity and it's just sitting up there. Whereas if you've got a resistance band, as soon as you start pulling on that band, you've got that elastic resistance right from the start. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said for the use of resistance bands.
I mean, that example you just gave of the old swing with the bicep curls is a classic one you see in the gym, isn't it? And it's a great analogy with the bands because as soon as you start swinging, you've applied some sort of momental force that's going to be coming up through your lift. So there's going to be at some point in there where the weight is still kind of in free fall going up, a bit like a clean where you're pushing off your hips and the bar sort of moving and you're trying to duck underneath. And so you're not actually applying full force at that point until the dumbbell stops moving up. But with the band, you've got no choice. It's there. If you swing it, it's going to ping you back at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. You put that stretch into the band, and it's going to come back and get you.
Exactly. And that could end up ugly or just really awkward for you at the same time. So I think certainly for bands, there's some fantastic options that it can help with traditional weightlifting. And I see it, possibly not necessarily the clientele listening to the podcast, but maybe some of the older sort of masters athletes where there is more of a potential from a safety point of view with lifting heavier weights, that they can still apply this massive activation of their muscles without the same resistance sort of on their shoulders or their hands or whatever it might be.
I think endurance athletes in general though, because endurance athletes don't spend a huge amount of time in the gym, then using the safest option that there is available is a really good thing, because it would suck to get injured in the gym. That's the number one thing that I take into consideration with all the stuff I do in the gym, with all the athletes that I work with, is that the first rule in the gym is do no harm. If you're getting athletes injured in the gym, you're going backwards. The whole reason you got them into the gym was to make them more resilient to injury so they could do their sport more, and now you've just sent them home injured and they can't do their sport. It's the complete opposite to what you wanted. So having a really safe option in the gym that can't really go too wrong. However, there are some hilarious videos online of resistance bands failing, especially during lockdown when people were attaching them to not so secure anchors and they were flicking off and pinging them in the face and that sort of thing. Besides all that, pretty safe options compared to, loading up a barbell and putting it on your back or whatever it might be.
Yep, 100% agree.
And then I think on the flip side of that, that's people that are new to strength potentially. But then if you've been around strength training for a long time, just having a new novel training stimulus can be, one of those things that sort of kickstart those new adaptations. If you're not used to something, your body will adapt relatively quickly to it. So if you've never used resistance bands before and you've always gone traditional barbell or dumbbell, then adding some resistance bands into the mix can be a really good option as well. Or even decreasing your load a little bit on the bar and adding resistance bands in combination there.
Yep, absolutely. And one of the other things we're going to look at some point with this EMG in the gym is kind of the warm-up, for the lift being done with the band. So you're getting that good muscle activation that you wouldn't get from a lower weight when you're, half your weight for your warm-up. You don't require the same force, so you don't warm up the same, and then you go to lift your main one. Like you said, the injury rate increases with that. And so whether you can warm up with a banded exercise to drive up the recruitment and then into your bigger lift that way.
Yeah, nice. So you're getting that potentiation effect with the band before you go into your key lifts. Yeah. That's a nice way of doing it for sure. Nick, super interesting topic, and I look forward to having those guys from Body Synergy on the podcast and having a little bit more of a talk about it, and hopefully trying it out myself. Anything else to add around that?
No, I think that might be enough geeking out on strength training for one day.
Brilliant. All right, team. So next little segment I want to talk about here is winter training, because it is winter, and winter can be a really hard time for some people. It's often one of those times where you've put in so much work over the summer and you think, this is the year. This is the year that I'm just going to keep going through winter. I'm going to come out the other side and I'm just going to build on top of whatever I did last year. And then you get about halfway through winter and the wheels start to fall off. It starts to get really dark and cold and wet. And rather than a calculated approach, you just go for the stuff it approach. I'll get back into the swing of things in springtime because I'm done with training at the moment. And it's a all too common sort of theme that I always see with winter training. So what I wanted to do is just talk around some things for winter training, what we're trying to achieve and how we can go about achieving that in a slightly smarter way than maybe we've done in the past. And a lot of this comes from the winter multi-sport base training plan that I have over at exponentialperformancecoaching.com/MS winter. So we're going to sort of talk around multi-sport in terms of covering all three disciplines. However, this can be applied to single discipline sports as well. So winter, it's here. First thing I think we should do is sit down and sort of have a little bit of a review of our previous season, assess those strengths and those weaknesses, and where could we make up some time or improve our performance the most. And once you've done that, and this is assuming that we've had a bit of an off season already, I'd expect that most athletes have had their off season, which is a period of no training or minimal training after their key event. And now they're working at getting back into their training. So once you've done that and you've assessed those strengths and weaknesses, it can be a really good time over winter to do some focused training blocks. So if you've noticed that your running could be improved a little bit, or your cycling or your kayaking or your swimming if you're a triathlete, putting some specific emphasis on one of those disciplines. So rather than being a multi-sport athlete over winter, focus on becoming a runner or becoming a biker or a kayaker or a swimmer and putting more emphasis on one discipline. That way you're able to scale back the other disciplines and have a maintenance training load, and then put a little bit more time and effort into those ones that you need to work on, so that as you come out of winter, you can sort of access that newfound level of performance within that one discipline. The other disciplines will come up because they're your stronger ones, but you've made gains on that weaker one there. And so a really good way to do that is pick some specific singular discipline events to focus on. So if you're going to do a running block over winter, which can be a really good one to do because a lot of people struggle with their running, and if you focus on becoming a runner over winter, lining up a couple of maybe half marathons or off-road races to work towards, it can be really good because when you're running, you usually stay a lot warmer than the other disciplines. So it helps you get through winter that way. It works on your weakness and you come out of it fitter at the other end. Same thing can go for biking. If you're weak on the bike, then winter can be a really good time to put in a big block of focused indoor training. So crack out the indoor trainer, get your Zwift on, put a lot of time in on the bike. On the weekends where you can get out in the middle of the day when it's a bit warmer, you can put in some more time then. But just structuring things around that weaker discipline that you've got can be a really good idea. Winter's also a great time to focus on those areas that are often neglected by endurance athletes. Now, I don't want to stereotype anyone out there. However, endurance athletes are chronic for neglecting strength training and technique work, in my experience. They usually have no problem doing long sessions and strength-based hill work out there on the bike and running, and they love that. The longer, the harder, the better. However, when it comes to strength work and technique work, it often gets pushed to the side in favour for those harder, longer sufferfests. So winter can be a great time to target your strength training to build that injury resilience, as we've sort of talked about already in this podcast. And then also working on your technique, building your technique foundation. And this, comes in the form of specific technique drills when you come to running, come to riding, and then also for your paddling and for your swimming as well. Over winter can be a great time to use those, because when you're training your technique, you're training what we call our neuromuscular system, the signals that are coming from the brain down to the muscles to fire them in the correct sequence, kind of what Nick was talking about with that EMG stuff before. We want to get the muscles firing in the right sequence to propel us forward when we're running, biking, kayaking. With the neuromuscular system, it fatigues really quickly because we're training new pathways and we're firing muscles that potentially don't like being fired in that sequence, or stronger ones trying to dominate them, as in Nick's example with the EMG. There's so much crossover today, Nick. It's unbelievable. Because your neuromuscular system fatigues really quickly because it's not conditioned for these new movement patterns that we're trying to train, you don't actually have to invest a huge amount of time into it. But the improvements that you get in your efficiency far outweigh the sort of time invested into it. So it's a great way of doing shorter, more focused sessions during the winter when you don't want to spend a heap of time outside, but you get really good bang for your buck. So if we think back to that strength training, getting into the gym over this phase, it's a really good time to get into the gym, because if you're not used to strength work, you will probably end up sore for your first couple of weeks of strength work, because your body's just adapting to it and you get a bit of muscle damage. However, muscle damage during winter doesn't matter too much, because that soreness isn't going to have a huge negative impact on our training, because our training is going to be largely low intensity anyway. Have a listen to episode 66, where we talk about how to approach your first gym session so that you don't crawl out of there crippled through muscle soreness. So episode 66 to have a listen to that. Couple more things for winter is that I like to focus on shorter, more consistent sessions rather than fewer, longer sessions as well. So we're outside for shorter periods of time, or indoors, but this just helps with that mental freshness. If you're outside in the rain and the cold for a 3-hour session, it can be quite demoralizing, especially if it's your 9th 3-hour wet cold session in the last 3 weeks. But if you're outside for say 30 to 45 minutes, you're working on some technique drills, and then your next session you know that you're indoors in the gym, mentally it can be a lot easier to get through that. We really want to avoid any burnout or mental staleness in the middle of winter, because when we haven't even got to that time period where our training's most important. And the final thing is to mix it up. If you've been riding your road bike a lot, get rid of your road bike, because a road bike can get quite cold. Higher speeds, the wind chill taken into account there. Trade it in for the mountain bike or the gravel bike and go and, ride some trails. Tends to happen at a lower speed. You stay a little bit warmer. You're expecting to get a little bit of mud, a little bit of spray off the road, so you dress accordingly. Likewise, take up some snow sports as well. Skiing, snowboarding, great time obviously to do that. And not only do those sports help with breaking up your movement patterns, strengthening muscles that might not have been used in that way for quite a while, but also a much needed psychological and mental freshness break. So I highly encourage any athletes that I'm working with, if they do enjoy the snow sports, is to make the most of them. But the overall aim, what we're trying to achieve, is to head into spring and then summer physically and psychologically fresh, strong, efficient, because we've addressed our neuromuscular technique sort of foundation, and overall healthy, so that you can put in a good spring training block. And that's what the winter multi-sport base training plan that's over at the Exponential Performance website is all focused on, is getting multi-sport athletes into that springtime through the winter in good shape, ready to go. Nick, winter training, what do you reckon?
Two things. I've got one question for you before I go on, though. We're talking winter training versus base training. And obviously, winter training is a term that works if you're training for something in summertime. If you're training for something early spring,
yes.
How would you slightly differ some of that?
Absolutely. So winter, I guess winter is kind of synonymous with base training in a lot of respects. And everyone sort of is well aware that base training needs to be kind of long and slow to develop your, that aerobic base to some degree. And that's obviously not the only way to develop your aerobic base. However, if you were training for something in springtime, there would be a little bit more urgency, obviously, to get revamped and refreshed a little quicker, so that you are going to have to train through that later part of winter. Absolutely. For most multi-sport athletes, thinking with the coast to coast in mind, which is in February, then it is really much that winter training is our base training as well. However, we are going to come out into springtime with a longer time to be able to build up for that. So it's a little bit different, I guess, than if you were tackling something in springtime. If you are tackling something in springtime, everything just moves back a little bit. Yeah,
I think it's getting trickier and trickier, and especially in New Zealand. I assume it's the same around the world, but a lot of the marathons and running events happen sort of late winter, early spring.
Absolutely.
Some of those bigger mountain bike events are happening early spring as well, and then there's something else happening late summer. So that kind of season of winter build up through summer and spring and race the late summers is kind of going quite quickly.
100%. So just thinking, if that is you that you need to be training pretty hard in winter, I think the biggest thing you can do is get some good gear, like a good jacket, good gloves, good tights, hat to keep you warm. And then indoor training alternatives are crucial as well. Zwift's been a game changer for so many people.
Yeah, it has. And get some good training groups and training buddies. It's always easier, if it's bucketing down to go outside with someone else because someone else is going through it with you. So it's big upside to winter training is with friends.
Absolutely. And in winter training as well can be super, super fun, eh? And that once you get over that hurdle of the weather and you get out of your door, which is often the hardest part of winter training, is getting out of the door, getting over that doorstep, then it's a lot of fun. You get wet, you get muddy, but it's a lot of fun. And I think the cyclocross is such a good example of that. It'd be, I remember when we were in Dunedin together, obviously, and it would be pouring down on a Sunday afternoon at like 4 o'clock, and all you wanted to do is put the fire on or stay by the fire because it had been going all day and not go anywhere. But once you got out and you got going at the, cyclocross race, it was the best fun ever.
Yeah. First one of them this weekend, actually. So
oh, really?
It's very timely. Looking forward to it.
It's on.
Yeah. One other thing I was just going to add in terms of the options for winter is it's a perfect time or for athletes to be looking to lose any body weight that they're looking to lose for spring, summertime racing. You want to be hitting, like you said, your springtime kind of build phases at your roughly ideal race weight. When you're doing your big volume training, you don't want to be trying to lose weight because you're going to be smashed. You're going to, you're not going to recover properly, and you're going to be lacking energy if you're trying to cut back on calories while your training volume is ramping up. So spend that, 8 to 12, 16 weeks, whatever it is, through your winter sort of off-season time to get on top of your nutrition, get your weight down if you do need to, get your weight up if you need to as well, depending on where you're sitting. Put on that muscle mass in the gym, like you said, because again, once you start your big volume training, it's going to be harder to put on muscle mass through resistance training. So perfect opportunity to work on body comp and weight.
Yeah, fantastic point. So if there are any multi-sporters out there that have got the coast to coast in mind and aren't really too sure how to integrate all the different facets of their training into their program over winter, get over to exponentialperformancecoaching.com/MSwinter, and you can have a look at the multi-sport winter base training plan over there. And that leads really nicely into the coast-to-coast training plans that we also have up over at exponentialperformancecoaching.com. So these set a really good foundation over winter to then launch into those programs in springtime. Nick, anything else on winter training?
No, I think you nailed it towards the end there. Just enjoy it. Find some fun events, little local cyclocross races, cross-country running races. There's plenty of winter kind of multi-sport or kayak races, going on, orienteering races or road training.
Yeah.
And there's plenty, join a social netball team or play some squash. Get out there and do something slightly different just to keep the body ticking. That can freshen up your mind. So yeah, come build time, come springtime, whenever that may be, you're fired up, ready to go.
Bloody ease yourself into those high-intensity court sports, though, because the old endurance bodies aren't usually very well adapted to them, and we don't want to hear of any people blowing out their Achilles or their knees on the netball courts, please.
Good point.
Awesome, team. That's all we've got for you this week. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to get your hands on one of these T-shirts Nick is wearing, Harden Up T-shirt, or hat that I've got here, Harden Up Inc., or any of our other merch, you can check it over at exponentialperformancecoaching.com/shop, and we've got everything over there for some gear to give you constant daily reminders about how you can be better and push yourself a little bit further. But until next episode, get out there and train hard, but most importantly, train smart. We'll talk to you later.